welcome everybody on this presentation of Mr. Orenstein. Yes, he is associate professor of the University of Pennsylvania and just guiding here nearly 30 students from the university who try to get acquaintance with the situation of Hungary now and I think partly with the war going between Russia and Ukraine with Russian aggression. He is he's as a professor specializing in politology and the dealing with Ethiopian societies, Ethiopian regimes, now mainly post-communist regimes. He published several books. The last of this is Taking Stock of Shock, and he has already 8-9 books or something like that. If I can count, dealing with not only these political problems and the way of transition, partly economic transition, neoliberalism after the regime change in Eastern Europe, but some social aspects of the development as well. Pension funds, what is the situation of the pensioners, and it's a wide range of topics what his study and work is covering. So let me give the floor to Michel. Thank you very much for being here. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you. So thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's a real pleasure to speak to you about my work on what I'm going to speak about comes from my book that I wrote, published in 2019, called The Lands in Between, Russia versus the West and the New Politics of Hybrid War, which I began working on after Russia's invasion of Crimea, and also around the time of the sort of Russia's electoral intervention in U.S. politics in 2016. I began writing a book that I saw as a sort of explainer of what is happening, like what's going on, and it added some analysis of how Central European regimes are reacting to the conflict that was emerging between Russia and the West. What I want to do today, I will talk in general about the book, but what I want to do today is to talk a little bit more currently about current events and bring it up to date, and sort of view the current crisis through the lens of the analysis in that book. And so I'm going to divide this into my remarks. I'm going to actually try to keep it fairly brief and answer a lot of questions, which we anticipate coming from the audience here or through Facebook. To talk about three things. One is the question of what to call this, right? So in my book, I called this a hybrid war. And at the same time, there are many people who describe this conflict as a new Cold War. I want to take issue with that. People now are also saying this is the beginning of World War III. So I want to explain why the hybrid war concept was right before and still is right today for describing what's going on and defend the use of that terminology. Secondly, I want to just describe what this hybrid war consists of now. We're not looking at just the Ukraine conflict. Of course, that's what we all are looking at on our newspapers every day. But there are many theaters actually in which this conflict is being fought out. And I want to discuss, at least mention all of them or many of them. And then finally, I want to talk a bit about, sorry, I have just clearing my throat. Finally, I have a few future scenarios. And I want to talk a little bit, because everybody's concerned right now about what's going to happen. The most likely question I've been getting in the past several days is, what do you think is going to happen? I don't know, obviously, what's going to happen, but I will say that that there are several more likely scenarios than others, right? There are several scenarios we can think through that make a lot of sense. Okay, so first thing, is this a new Cold War? I never liked, in developing a book, and sort of stating, in 2019, what was going on, you have to come up with some type of description of that, ideally one that fits on a soundbite or a title of your book. And I looked at a lot of the academic literature. It's actually very, very broad. There's many, many terms, some of which are, I felt quite technical, and I wasn't really that satisfied with them. I like to be kind of, I guess, a simplifier, right? Somebody who's drawing out the essence of things. And, but I really felt at the time I didn't like the metaphor of a new Cold War. And I'll explain to you why. The new Cold War idea, of course, there was an old Cold War. We know a lot about it. And it was, to some extent, similar countries that are involved on either side, although, you know, there was some important changes like Hungary. But I didn't like the concept for one main reason, which is that this war was not cold. It was not a Cold War. This war was a lot hotter than the Cold War had been, at least in Europe. And of course, we should remember that the Ukraine has been under Russian invasion since 2014. It seemed unreasonable to call this a Cold War because they were fighting, actually, in Europe since 2014. Second reason I didn't like the Cold War concept is that in the Cold War, it seemed to me the essence of the Cold War was that there was a clear dividing line in Europe, an iron curtain, that separated the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union from the sphere of influence of the West. And that's exactly what had broken down, right? Exactly the nature of the conflict that we had in Europe and have had in Europe is one in which there isn't a real clear dividing line. What was going on was a tug of war between Russia and the West over all these different countries in between, including Hungary, including, of course, most particularly the countries in between Russia and the European Union, but even also extending to European Union states and core member states of the EU, even North America, where this battle is happening. So there's no clear dividing line. It's not cold. So I didn't think Cold War is a very good metaphor. There are a lot of other similar terminologies to hybrid war. But I ended up with a hybrid, and I know some people who invented the term were quite upset also that I used the term hybrid war, because they said, well, what you're talking about is not really how we had initially defined it. I'm sorry, but sometimes when you put a concept into the world, it doesn't stay defined exactly the way you defined it. And so, yes, I'm defining it in a somewhat different way, but I was very, very pleased. One of the moments I felt happy or verified, I guess, in my own analysis was when Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission president, talked about the migrant crisis between Belarus and Poland and said, this is a hybrid war tactic. And I thought, okay, now this terminology, pretty much in the way I'm using it, the way I'm defining it, not only me, of course, but many others, has now become a kind of defining way of looking at the crisis. And I think it's the right way to look at the crisis, because the nature of the conflict is that there is a kinetic, military aspect to it that has been ongoing, but there are also many, many other aspects to it that include. I think the best way to think about it is actually different theaters of this war. There's one theater that's the cyber conflict, right? There's another theater that's the disinformation conflict, the social media conflict. There's another theater that's the sanctions conflict, right? There's another theater which is the oil and gas, revenues and conflict, right, or blackmail conflict, right? So I think of and those involve different countries. So the U.S. was very much subject to this war in the information space. Obviously, not so much in the kinetic space, but so I think that the nice thing about the hybrid war terminology is it allows us to see the conflict between Russia and the West in multiple sort of dimensions that remain ongoing right now. There's not just a war on the ground in Ukraine. Okay, this is a war that's taking place in our own territories, right? Just by means that are not kinetic. And so let me just take a step back to say, well, why is this war even really happening, right? The conflict happens, in my view, because since at least 2007, and probably I would place this at more like 2005, 2006. Honestly, I don't have as much clarity as I'd like to have about the thinking within the Russian administration in those years. but there's a lot of evidence that the Putin regime was thinking about the West and particularly the EU as an enemy, starting basically in 2005, 2006. But I would say at least in 2007 we can say that, because Putin said it very publicly at the Munich Security Conference. At the Munich Security Conference in 2007, Putin came and said and declared the end of the U.S. unipolar world. And so we're now in a multipolar world. Who wanted, American dominance anyway? And we're, that was like a kind of declaration of war, essentially. But at the same time, Russia had a very strong interest, being that we're talking about conflict between nuclear armed states, essentially. It was not going to be convenient for really anybody in this struggle to have this war be extremely kinetic. It's not going to be about launching stuff at one another. This war had to be fought out with more subtle means, and that explains the wide range of means that are used that are sub-military, often not noticed. Let me back up a second and again say, why did Putin feel that he had to launch this war in 2007? I think it was really critical that the Russian regime, by its nature, just heard Professor Magyars in the audience who introduced me, who's written very, very, eloquently about the nature of the Russian regime and its, the mafia state, in Russia, or its autocratic nature. It felt existentially threatened by the European Union, right? By the promotion of democracy, which is seen within the European Union as being an eminently peaceful act, right? Something that is actually peace-preserving qualities. When you promote democracy in Hungary, or democracy in Poland, or democracy in Yugoslavia, from the European Union perspective, that is promoting peace. From a Russian perspective, it's promoting war. Because from the Russian perspective, Putin is not running a democratic regime. His biggest fear, actually, is that there could be pro-democracy protests on the streets of Moscow, that he'll face internal opposition, and therefore innocent, acts of peace are seen as a declaration of war and an existential threat in Russia. And so this complete sort of jarring, in a way, misconception or difference of conception of what constituted a threat. There are other threats, of course. We know about, Russia was never very comfortable with NATO expansion, to acknowledge all these other things that were going on. I don't mean to exclude those, and just to say that for a variety of reasons, including democracy promotion, Russia saw that there was an existential threat to it coming from the West, meaning the Putin clan, the Putin regime, and felt the need to push back and take the war basically into opposing territory. But of course, it couldn't do that in a directly military way for a variety of reasons, the most important one being nuclear weapons. But so most of this war was fought by sort of subvert means that were intended to be not noticed, right? I think the best illustration of this, to my mind, is the Medvedev presidency in Russia, where just around the time, I guess, or just before the Russo-Georgian War, right, Medvedev was elevated to the presidency of Russia, and he was perceived, I know we have a diplomat in the audience to verify this, perceived by Western diplomats and Western leaders in Western Europe as being a step forward towards democracy in Russia. Right? He was warmly welcomed in Brussels, warmly welcomed in Strasbourg. He was seen as somebody who was a next Russia, a sort of step towards liberalism, and trusted by many European leaders. At the same time, while European leaders often, and even US leaders, perceived that as a liberalism, they overlooked the fact that one of his first acts was the Russo-Georgian War, was the invasion of Georgia, right? So there are these kind of mixed messages coming from Russia that actually, on the one hand, yes, we're moving in the direction you wish and desire most deeply, but we're also invading Georgia. Just, don't just ignore that. It's not any of your concern really, because it's not actually Europe, not actually NATO. And by this sort of means, was able to pursue this kind of hybrid war against the West for 4 years without anybody even noticing, which I talk about in the book. And it wasn't really until, I believe, around 2011, until the Bullet Knife protests in Moscow started to sort of wake up some German leaders about that in the parliamentary elections of that year. But really, it was when Putin came back to the presidency in 2012, when Angela Merkel and other German leaders sort of raised some alarm and said, uh-oh, Russia's not progressing in the direction that we expected. We're very concerned about this. And then, again, not until 2014 that Europe really did anything about it because of the Crimea annexation. And really the shooting down of MH17, which has to be remembered as an event. It's unusual that the shooting down of an airliner in war would have such a big effect, but I think it did, frankly, because there were too many EU citizens on that plane. And it really brought home to Europe the fact that a war in Ukraine could have a direct impact on EU citizens, essentially. So from 2014, there were a lot of people aware, but even since then, honestly, it hasn't been fully widely accepted, right? I was meeting, as Mr. Magyar said, I've been on a trip with American and actually a group of worldly and worldwide students around from the Wharton Business School around Poland and now Hungary. And we've been having a lot of interesting meetings, including looking into refugee relief agencies and also studying, of course, the conflict. We happened to met with a former Polish foreign minister a couple of days ago, who was, remarking that, from the point of view of Russia hawks, right, we were right? Poland was right. The Baltic states were right? That this regime was terrible. It was expansionary. It was worrisome. It needed to be addressed. And, to some extent, I have to say that that's how all of us feel, essentially, who've been in that camp, that we were validated now. But frankly, we have not been very totally validated in the past, right? In the past several years, even since 2014, it's been interesting to see that in my own country, in the United States, there's quite a lot of disinformation. There's a big segment of one of the major parties, the Republican Party, that's been pro-Putin, essentially. And there has been an atmosphere of, so we say these things and we sound a lot like conspiracy theorists or something like that, or we sound a little bit crazy, whatever. But there's just other points in the debate. There's other elements of the debate. There's other people saying, no, Putin's actually good. Our president, saying, actually, we want to be friends with Russia, saying that actually he's a genius for invading Ukraine. All these sorts of things make their way into public sentiment. And so, honestly, it hasn't been a unanimous viewpoint, let's put it that way. And that's been one of the very big transformations in the last couple of weeks, that now it's a pretty unanimous or highly unanimous view. I would say 80-90% of people see Russia as a major threat, see the invasion as wrong, see Putin as kind of evil, and so that's kind of where we are. I guess the second point I want to move on, though, to talking the second point of what is really happening now and what is going on with the hybrid conflict at the moment. So I want to say this because, again, from the point of view of my analysis, I see things that in a slightly different way maybe than people are seeing them presently. Right now, all of our eyes are on the obvious terrible horrors that's going on in Ukraine, the refugees that are streaming out into Poland. I was just in Poland. I imagine in Hungary it's a similar situation, but in Poland, there's 100,000 refugees arriving per day. And pretty much every poll that we came encountered with so far is either housing refugees or knows somebody who's housing refugees, right? It's interesting in Poland, it's the entire society. It's a very self-organizing thing where civil society groups are doing more than the state to match up refugees with resources of the domestic civil society. They're placing refugee agencies that are NGOs are placing people in family homes, directly in private homes. They're not overseen by any sort of authority or anything like that. And the process is so efficient in Poland that even with 100,000 refugees per day arriving, which by the way is more than the yearly allocation in the United States, my own country, that you don't see actually big backups besides just the immediate border area. Do you remember when there was the Syrian refugee crisis? You would often see Syrians all over the streets of Istanbul. You know, they were showing up in parks. Nothing like that in Poland. You don't see refugees on the streets. The refugees are slotted directly from the border into somebody's house, you know, or a city. So it's like a incredibly smooth, considering the obvious. You know, I'm sure right at the border it probably looks a lot more chaotic, but it's an incredibly smooth process. And I trust that something similar is also going on in Hungary. I haven't yet been able to look into that directly. So we're all focused on that. However, as I said at the beginning, that isn't really all of what's going on, right? There's a lot of things going on here. First of all, one element of the hybrid war is kind of saber rattling, I would call, not just the use of force, but the threat of the use of force, right? That is deployed not just against Ukraine, but against Poland. Poland is worried, the Baltic states are worried, Romania is worried, the United States is worried that a nuclear weapon could be deployed, you know. So that's one whole area of the hybrid conflict, I would say, of saber rattling. The other piece I mentioned is the oil blackmail, oil and gas blackmail. You probably experienced gas prices, petrol prices rising dramatically in the last several days. I haven't been here I just arrived last night to Budapest, but in Poland, it seemed that the prices had risen about 20% since I got there a few days ago. We're continuing to rise. You know, and that's an important, that's being deployed as a sort of, actually that had been deployed before the conflict in Ukraine. I want to remind people, right, that Russia had not been delivering the extent of gas that it normally does. So European gas reserves were actually relatively low as a result. So it's not just it was going on before that, and it will continue also throughout. Then there was also the favorite method of hybrid conflict on the Western side, right? We've been talking about this from the Russian side, of course, as being, in my view, the aggressive actor, right? Which is a little controversial too. A lot of people would say, well, they were forced to do this, and they're back against the wall, and so they have to do that. And that actually is probably the number one criticism I sometimes receive on the book. If I look at my sort of Amazon comments or something like that. The people who don't like this book, it's usually because they think I'm unfair somehow to the Russian perspective, right? I think I'm pretty fair in the sense that I'm saying, well, there's understandable reasons why they're upset. I get why they're upset, you know, and here's the reasons why they're upset and why they feel threatened and existentially threatened. But I think that the perception is that of saying that Russia is the aggressor here was more controversial than other things I was saying in the book. Because a lot of people would say, well, no, quite the opposite. It's actually the West is, you know, imperialist and has been pushing them into a corner, and now they're just sort of pushing back, and you're saying that's aggressive. And, so I guess that's kind of a reasonable point, except that now you can kind of see in Ukraine that it is Russia being aggressive, right? So that's kind of a little bit turn the tables on that set of arguments. In any case, the West is also involved, obviously. So at a certain point, I believe Russia started this conflict, launched this hybrid war in 2007. The West didn't even know it was really happening for quite some time. But then it's fought back. And the way that it's fought back has been also through these hybrid techniques, also unwilling to use military force largely. But the weapon of choice for the West has really been sanctions, essentially. To some extent, the EU has also worked in the oil and gas sphere to diversify supplies. I don't know if they were that successful in doing that, but to some extent have been somewhat successful and are going to continue to be more successful in the future. So I have quite a significant section in the book on the EU efforts to create a unified European energy market, which is, I think been important. The ways that it tried to regulate the Nord Stream pipeline, to regulate, unbundle gas, etc. But I'll just talk about the primary way that we've been pushing back is sanctions. Why sanctions? Well, I think that the best way to think about this is that in each of these theaters of the conflict, let's take, a cyber conflict, right? U.S. has cyber tools. Estonia, I guess, has a NATO center for cybersecurity for NATO. NATO has cyber tools. Russia has cyber tools. The analysts that I listen to in this sphere think that there's, in a way, a sort of rough parity there, right? We could do a lot of damage to Russia. They could do a lot of damage to us in the cyber field. Similarly, in the area of nuclear weapons, they could definitely, they actually have arguably superior nuclear forces, right? At least numerically. We don't know how they work, but numerically, they, in theory, have superior forces to U.S., counts of nuclear weapons, NATO counts of nuclear weapons. But let's say anyway that both sides have a credible threat of being able to blow up the other. So let's just call that rough parity, in the nuclear field. In the sanctions field, in the economic warfare, Russia is extremely disadvantaged, extremely backwards, extremely weak. The Russian economy is only the size of the Italian economy, and the Western economies together are so much larger, it's not even really a fair fight in the economic field. Just one example on this. So when the last time European Union and U.S. put joint sanctions on Russia, which really substantially limited its banks from accessing Western financial markets, Russia's response to that was that they banned the import of certain food items from the EU to Russia. They banned Norwegian salmon. They banned Polish apples. They banned milk. From some countries. Things that honestly, on the first glance, it looked like those things were going to hurt Russia more than they were going to hurt the Western countries, essentially, because they could find some other market, for these things. So, in a way, just a long way of saying that Russia doesn't have an answer for sanctions, as we can see today. That if we sanction collectively them and through the SWIFT system, take them off the SWIFT system, how are they going to push back against that? They could say, well, you can't buy any more of our oil and gas, but they haven't said that, have they? Because actually they're dependent on those revenues, right? They're totally dependent on Europe. One thing that's not often recognized in the West is that Russia is more dependent on the West than we are on Russia. So they're absolutely dependent for 50% of their foreign revenue on selling oil and gas primarily to Europe. And if you include Turkey, then almost 100% dependent. So so that's why we're fighting back with sanctions. This is a hybrid war, and therefore we have to analyze this. Although we wanted to talk about Ukraine today, and obviously that's the most important and immediate sort of thing that's going on. This is an accelerating conflict in a number of different theaters, essentially. So where do I want to end? I don't want to go on and on. I feel like I've done that already, but I do want to just make a couple points about what are possible. What are we looking at as possible future scenarios in this conflict? So I spent some time with some colleagues in Warsaw discussing, and they were very very worried and talking about a lot of very apocalyptic scenarios. And I think honestly, that's perfectly relevant, perfectly understandable, and there is a risk of escalation of the conflict. That is a reasonable scenario, and I say that because if you look at the debate over fighter planes, supplying fighter planes to Russia, the first thing in that U.S. statement that was made was that we're worried about escalation. Well, that tells me that escalation is a scenario, right? That is definitely of concern to military planners and is absolutely a feasible outcome of this conflict, is that there could be the use of nuclear weapons, there could be further other types of military escalation. Other countries could be brought into the war. I think every day that we see, children being buried in a rebel maternity hospital in Ukraine, it becomes harder to justify not being involved, in this conflict. So there is that. But there are other scenarios as well, I think, that we should consider, right? It may not be the most likely scenario. Certainly appears to be one that a lot of actors are intent on avoiding. So what are the other possible scenarios? To me, one possible way this could sort of end would be, in fact, the creation of a new Cold War, right? Whereas today, as I've argued, we don't have a clear dividing line in Europe. Maybe tomorrow, that's where Putin will push us, right? That there could be a situation in which Putin's armies would sort of like stop on a certain line, right? And sort of say, okay, this on this side of the line, that's our sphere, and this on that side of the line is your sphere. And we're going to agree to a kind of détente. We're basically like the Cold War. You don't mess around in our sphere. We don't really mess around in your sphere, except in, kind of covert ways. So I do think that that's a reasonable, although this period has not been one characterized by Cold War, I think we could be heading towards another Cold War division of Europe. Just because you see so many aspects that have become very vivid right now of, Russia animated by a different ideology than the West. Russia isolated economically, right, from the West. These are all features that are starting to look more, like the only thing we're missing is that dividing line. But it's possible that Putin could declare a dividing line, and the West could accept that dividing line, simply because nobody's going to push back the Russian army, beyond that, and because it would be better to have some sort of divided Europe than would to have a conflictual Europe, essentially. The third possibility I'd want to suggest is, kind of a ongoing, more low intensity conflict. The conflict eventually sort of tamps down a bit and becomes Ukraine, whatever piece of Ukraine that Russia occupies or seeks to grab more of, will be a continuing sort of thorn in the side of the EU, something, a festering wound in the heart of Europe that Putin will continue to push on at will whenever he feels like they've grabbed more territory, accelerate, decelerate conflict. And we'll be living with this war in Ukraine for, as long as we live with the war in Crimea, or rather the war in the Donbass, where there's thousands of people dying, but not millions, and we don't really have any will to deal with it, and neither side is really able to move too much behind from a line of demarcation. There's one other scenario, and I have to look at my notes to remember which one it is. Yes, and the final scenario to discuss is, of course, the possibility of an uprising in Russia itself. So there's certainly evidence that Russians are very upset about this whole situation. Most of my Russian friends, not surprisingly, tend to come from the more liberal end of the spectrum. Those people are very, very anti-war. Actually, when they can, protesting against the war, speaking out against the war in ways that sometimes are complicated for them or even dangerous. They're extremely upset about their own country's behavior. And I think we all know this, right? They're under attack too. That's another aspect you could say of this hybrid war. This isn't only a war against somebody else, it's also an internal conflict that Russia is fighting. The regime fighting its own people, essentially. And so, to some extent, I mean, you don't want to overplay this, but to some extent, Russians are victims too, right, in this conflict. And so I think they're, jokingly, I said to a friend, I sort of regretted saying this immediately, but maybe I could just use a joke right now, but just say that, how many intellectuals does it take to storm the Winter Palace? We have that type of joke with how to screw in a light bulb in the US, but the issue is it's unclear if that liberal intellectual venue has the power really to destabilize the regime. I think they feel that they don't, for the most part. That's my sense of it. But of course, there are things they can do, but a lot of those things have been restricted now, right? So they could have a TV station that could inform people, right? But that's been shut down now. They could have maybe a university in exile. Maybe that will be set up. But that's not going to necessarily, once you're in exile, I don't know if that's going to force regime change at home necessarily. So, one has to look at other places. Obviously, within the elite itself, there's a possibility of elite members being dissatisfied with this direction that Putin's taken in. That they want to see some different type of regime. They want to have the playground in Western Europe. They want to have safety for their assets and their children in Western Europe. So therefore, this whole situation doesn't really work for them very well. And maybe they could call an end to the regime. Another possibility is the kids dying at the front and the mothers of the kids dying at the front, which was a factor in the Afghanistan conflict, and it seems to be a factor already today. There appear to be thousands of Russian deaths and casualties. Those can kind of blow back. Somebody asked me yesterday, well, how can Russians fight this conflict if they don't even know it's happening, right? The disinformation being so strong in Russia that people will just stay with the regime whatever happens. And a response would be, well, what about, if your son comes home in a casket, right? You could be as brainwashed as you like, you still may oppose the regime, right? So I'll just leave it at that. I should say one more thing, which is that I despite having, I think, pretty accurately diagnosed what was going on in this conflict, I didn't actually think that Putin was going to go and invade Ukraine the way he did. And I'll tell you my reasons for that. I just thought that it was obvious to me that a number of things would happen that in fact did happen. So the West would unify, it would slap tremendous sanctions on Russia. It would be extremely damaging, damage the Russian economy, even damage the oil trade. Finland and Sweden would likely join NATO. Russia would not be successful in the war. It would get bogged down in Ukraine. It would suffer a lot of casualties. And I thought, seeing all those things, Putin would not choose to invade Ukraine. However, he doesn't appear to have seen all those things. So this is where I was wrong, I think. He seems to have underestimated many of the consequences, or had a different view about it, that he wanted, some of these consequences, right, to be achieved, which goes to this new Cold War sort of scenario. So, not being, quite. I think in foreign policy analysis, everybody who's been in it for a while is really pretty humble about their ability to predict the future. And so one of the common ways of addressing that is to say, well, there are potential scenarios that you can have. So I presented you with some scenarios today, having had this bracing experience of not being right about that decision to invade, which I didn't publish anywhere. I'm just admitting this to you. So I just hope that'll, sort of guide the discussion to some extent. I look forward to your questions. So thank you. Yes, please. It is McCoy, is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. I had two questions. One is, you talked about the relative parity in cyber war and in nuclear war. What about in disinformation war? I mean, clearly Russia has superiority in controlling its own society, but what about also the foreign intervention versus our own capacity? And is it a difference of capacity or will to use it? And the second question is, you haven't mentioned China at all as part of a new Cold War or a new whatever bipolarity between democracies and autocracies. And I wonder if you have views about that.
Yeah, those are both really great questions. I'll try to be really brief because I can be really long answering questions, and I don't want to be, because I know there are a lot of other questions. Briefly on the disinformation. So I would say actually that there has been in this war parity between Russia's use of the information space or disinformation and Ukrainian. I mean, Ukrainians have been fantastic on social media. Zelensky has skyrocketed to be like a sort of world hero, you know. And that's not just because he's a charismatic person, but simply because they have a really well-honed set of social media techniques themselves to outreach, which they developed during and after the Crimea conflict. And I know a lot about it because I follow a lot of those influencers, you know, the Ukrainian influencers, and of various stripes. And, you know, I see what they're doing and the sophistication they have, and their media operation is really very impressive. In fact, you could argue for them, since they don't have a lot of other means, they've really focused on the information space because that's what they do have access to. They have a lot of Ukrainians who have other languages and media techniques. You know, they're great. And I think they've shown that and won, actually. In a lot of ways, the Ukrainians won that battle. So yeah, I mean, I do think that NATO countries have a lot of information. You know, but the issue we've had is not being willing or able to use it because of disunity. Once we unified, you know, and I think honestly, President Biden's, you know, information war here was to sort of state at the beginning, Russia's going to invade, Russia's going to invade, Russia's going to invade, and that really, in a way, set up the thing that when he did invade, that all of a sudden unity clicked into place throughout the Western sphere, right? Because people were primed of like, this is Putin's war. This is Putin's war. And then, look, he did it. He went ahead and did it. And now we have to do something about it, right? So I think that there are definitely information, you know, resources on both sides. And the China issue, yeah, I mean, could you conceptualize this? I'm sort of narrowly conceptualizing this as a European issue, Russia versus the West. But could you see this more in the frame of democracies versus autocracies? Possibly. You know, that is also the sort of framing du jour. I think it's accurate to some extent. You know, Professor Magyar might have some interesting insights on that. I think there, however, are some issues in operationalizing and some problems. You know, one is that not everybody in the Western sphere is democratic. Minor exceptions. Another being that you know, we don't really know that much about the China-Russia relationship, right? So, you know, definitely the democracies appear to want to bring a conflict to the autocracies, right? We want to delegitimize them in the public sphere. We want to show that we have a superior system. We want to show that we're richer, we're better able of creating a good life for people. Russia and China, I don't know if they've really fully picked up that conflict. To some extent they have, but maybe I'm not sure that they're doing that, to what extent they're doing that in tandem. Russia and China, to my view, and I think a lot of foreign policy communities view, has a complicated relationship. Putin has said that, you know, this is a close alliance, but the Chinese haven't really given their full-throated support to the war in Ukraine. If you remember, China has for many years said we don't support invading other countries' sovereignty. Honestly, I think it would be a huge reputational cost to China to be seen over the long term as supporting Russia's actions in invading another state. And we don't know what kind of conclusions they're drawing about their desire to take Taiwan someday, whether this looks like this has worked out really well or not, what the Western reaction might be or not, what they're risking. So I don't know, and also Russia has a lot of anxieties vis-a-vis China. China is a much bigger economy, has a much bigger population. Russia is like a big empty country that could have a lot more Chinese citizens if they allowed it. So I don't know. It's a good question. Yeah, I think you could paint it that way. I didn't paint it that way, and I guess because of this kind of focus on, for me, the conflict right now is about Europe. It's about European security, and maybe that's also kind of an American kind of perspective on that. That our security in the United States is very much bound up with European security, and I think it's a reminder that's I think in a way the biggest impact of the book that I've done is to try to remind Americans that our security actually is connected with European security, right? And there's certain reasons for that. And institutions that guard that, and rationales for those institutions, essentially. Anyway, there are other questions that will. Do we have maybe some from the Facebook audience? Nothing out there? Okay, good. Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Very exciting. Interesting. I fully agree with you that this is not a second world war.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, as a matter of fact, the Russians Putin doesn't ever use the word war.
Mm-hmm.
It is a swear word. It is prosecuted. He says it is Specjalnaya Военная Operacja, which is a special military operation.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Russians are, well, remembering the Second World War, war as a word probably would not be the right word to use. To me, sometimes it appears that it is a one-man show.
Yeah.
The Cold War was supported on the Russian side by the entire establishment.
Mm-hmm.
Here, I really doubt whether Putin has got that support.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And to a certain extent, I also have got the feeling that this whole war is partly for the Western world and kind of redistribution of the world, but also for local domestic consumption.
Mm-hmm.
To show, well, I served in Ukraine for 3 years, and certain people there remembered the time when the Soviet Union existed, when we were big, great, influential, and we were feared. And sometimes I have got the feeling that Putin wants to restore part of the Soviet Union, or at least the Soviet sphere zone, and the Russian Empire of Peter I or Catherine II. They sound a bit strange. And well, as far as your third scenario is concerned, can you see any sort of evidence? I read the comment of one of the US senators, Lindsey Graham. Yes, and he used the word "take out." If memory serves me right, take him out. One way or the other.
Yeah. I don't know if the U.S. has really great experience with that, kind of approach, just because of like our attempts to take out, Fidel Castro, kind of blew back on us quite a lot.
Well, probably if they're going to release Mr. Navalny, there will be a vacancy there.
Yeah. No, I think that if you ask for, I think you have two questions. One of it is, do you have evidence for this third scenario? I think there's the direct evidence is the last 8 years in Donbass, right? So they've, achieved a lot of their goals by keeping an open conflict, sort of low intensity conflict festering. It may not have been enough to sort of prevent Ukraine's westward drift, but if you really, damage the economy, take out major cities, and then just park your trucks there, nobody's going to come and push your trucks anywhere, you can create a situation where Ukraine can't continue to develop, except for maybe some parts, so I do think that there is a lot of evidence that Russia would use that technique, so similarly Transnistria is another example. It seems like actually the most likely option, like that where, you could argue it's the most likely option where they're heading just because based on past experience.
Geographically, they're coming closer and closer to Transnistria.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know. I mean, I wish I knew, but I don't know which territories Putin thinks are expendable or not expendable. I mean, presumably he doesn't seem to want to take Lvov, but does he want to, Moldova to continue its trajectory towards the West or not? I mean, I have no idea, but probably it's like he has a bunch of different scenarios himself, right? And then your second question was more, is it one person? Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think this is a personalistic dictatorship, basically, right? And so I'll just say also, just giving further evidence, I would say that if you look throughout Russian history, even through the Soviet period, democratic period, Putin period, I would argue that every single leader, every single czar, of Russia has had a different foreign policy. Right, if you think of Stalin's foreign policy compared to Khrushchev's, right? Khrushchev's compared to Brezhnev's, Brezhnev's compared to, let's say, Gorbachev, Gorbachev compared to Yeltsin, so it seems that to me that it's pretty traditional in Russia, or expected in Russia, that each leader puts quite a very significant stamp on foreign policy, and probably on a lot of things, right? And so, but particularly now, I don't expect that the next leader of Russia would have a Putin foreign policy. They may be anti-Western to some degree, but I can't imagine, it's hard to imagine a leader coming to power who's more anti-Western, right, than Putin is, in my opinion. I think that they would at least try to sort of downscale a bit. The issue is it's going to be difficult. That's going to be hard to do because the West isn't going to just drop sanctions over, without demanding quite a lot at this point, so that makes it more complicated in a way. The fact that he launched this war and created that, open conflict makes it harder in a way for some leader to come in and say, oh, I'm going to solve this situation, because then they're going to have to do things that are unpopular immediately. I don't know. I mean, but I think it's really tempting to think that one could, attack the Kremlin, but again, the thing is that there's a reason that's a norm, in international politics, and the U.S. being this open society is very vulnerable, on that score. And so I don't see that as like something that the U.S. will reach for, probably. Yes.
There's a question coming from our Facebook audience. What do you think that European countries such as Greece, Bulgaria, or recently Hungary can do in this situation? Orbán told a few days ago that the worst outcome of the crisis would be a new Cold War. But as you said, something like this is eventually unavoidable. Pro-Russia EU members may go with the EU, but how can the European Union settle the relations with such members?
It's a complex question. I hope I can answer it accurately. It has a bunch of different parts to it. So one is this piece of, is the EU unified or not, right? And I would argue the EU is rather unified, right, in its reaction to Russia at this moment. Obviously, not that I'm sensitive to that issue, because in fact, a large part of the part of the book I didn't say anything about is about how a lot of countries facing this kind of struggle and this sort of like Manichean choice between the West or Russia kind of choose to have it both ways. And I think Orbán has been a good example of that, where he's a member, Hungary is a member of NATO, but he wants to have a really good relationship with Putin, way maybe subservient to Putin, slush fund, or I don't know exactly what the deal is, but certainly pipeline politics, etc., and positioned on both sides. But you see with the conflict made that kind of solution, that kind of boundary spanning, or I don't know what exactly you would call it, but kind of balancing, I guess is the word I would tend to use, is a really good game to play. Because if you think about it, in a conflict between two different sides, each of which really care about the outcome and are willing to pay good money, right, for you to be on their side, the best decision from a rational choice framework is to belong to both of them, right? because then one side pays you for this, you get the EU funds, and you get the gas revenues, right? Right. The problem with the framework overall or problem with that strategy, as Vladimir Plahotniuc, for instance, in Moldova showed, is it's a little risky, right? Because you could get caught out, right, at a certain point, and feel that all of a sudden the West decides, you know what, you're just loyal, we're going to ditch you, right? And that's like the last thing you want, because you want to keep always the lines open for both sides. And so that's why I think you see Orban's behavior recently has been to very much go back into the Western camps. They were supporting sanctions, at the same time not supporting cutting off the gas revenues, right, for obvious reasons. And but I think that the reality, in Europe, is that it's very, very, very unified right now. So by and large, one doesn't have to be very concerned about Bulgaria, Hungary, et cetera, whoever, Serbia, et cetera. Their behavior in this conflict, they're going to support, kind of Western response to a large extent, And in the final analysis, they would probably have to, be in a position with so much unity that they would, kind of be leaned on, eventually, if there was something else that the West really required, right? For instance, troops across their territory or anything like that, right? So, so that's one piece of it. I guess the way of thinking about it in political science is that issues, we talk a lot about in political science about issue salience. Like some issues rise up and down the political agenda. Sometimes it's important, sometimes it's not that important. Ukraine has been sort of not very important for the US, I think, for quite a long time. Now it's the most important issue. And so now what we see is there's a lot of political costs to having negative, to having different views. This can be seen in my own country, in the United States, where Republicans, a good part of the Republican Party has supported Putin, openly supported Putin, including the former president of the United States. And now that's having a lot of political costs, because with the midterm elections coming up, Republicans are worried, oh my gosh, I'm going to be accused of being the pro-Putin. I'm going to be like killing babies. Somebody's going to put up my face next to the dead babies in Ukraine, right? And then I'm going to be like toast, So I got to backtrack. I got to backpedal. I got to articulate that I love Ukrainians, and all this sort of stuff. So that's one part of the question. Could you read it again, actually? Though?
So, what do you think European countries can do in this situation? And
right.
Something like having a new Cold War is eventually unavoidable.
Yeah. And
by pro-Russian EU members go with the EU.
Yeah.
But how can the EU settle the relations with such members?
Yeah, I think, look, when it gets as deep, when the violence gets as deep as a new Cold War, again, there's going to have to be sort of conformity to some extent on both sides of that, right? I don't think, by the way, it's, as I said, there's several different outcomes that could happen. I don't think it's a definitive outcome. I think it's Orban's concern because he's been so able to play the straddle the fence on this, and that's really been a key part of his strategy. And so he's particularly concerned about the emergence of a new Cold War, which in his view would probably disenable his strategy, he wouldn't be able to pursue it anymore. So, but I don't think that's the only possible outcome. But in that outcome, I think that both sides would effectively enforce conformity on their side, as it did in the Cold War. Professor Margaret.
Just let me make a remark and ask your opinion about that there are two such side effects, let's call it side effects of this whole conflict, what we're not really waiting. One is the national building process within Ukraine and the supranational building within the EU as a result of this conflict. Practically everybody was surprised that Ukraine is ready to resist to such an extent, but already after the Orange Revolution and especially after Maidan, there were some researchers, Ukrainian one Dubrovsky, Hungarian one Vijay, who wrote together with some others a longer piece about this thing that division of national identity, which was linked to ethnicity, was disrupted already in Ukraine, and more Russian speakers, or who consider themselves to be Russian ethnic minorities, but still declare themselves loyal to Ukraine as Ukrainian citizens.
Right.
This was a surprise for everybody, which was embodied in this resistance or what we witnessed. But at the same time, this war, I think, it creates the big national myth. What was lacking, and practically this national myth is stolen from the Russians, because this is the great Ukrainian patriotic war.
Yes.
And this is the only one what they have.
Right.
And now their national myth is destroyed, and they became an aggressor. And this national myth is tied to the Ukrainian, which can strengthen the national identity to a huge extent. And what we could see in the Baltic states, that after a few decades, the Russian ethnic minority had no imperial Russian identity. It was lost, and they had a Baltic Russian identity, confronting the imperial Russian identity. And I think this is what's happening in Ukraine, in spite of the fact that the standard of living was lower in Ukraine than in Russia, and especially not was the case like in the Baltic states, where the standard of living, of course, was much higher. On the other hand, in Europe, in the case of the European Union, this conflict creates really the supranational strengths and accelerates the supranational identity. The European Union did not become a lame duck; it was born as a lame duck practically, and it still is a lame duck. It's a question that the reverse process that how should it work as a duck, really, and this is what's partly happening now. And when you mention Hungary and some other reluctant states, I think they will be swept away politically, and they feel that they cannot afford anymore in such a crisis and war situation to go against of emerging a more effective decision-making mechanism within the EU. So these are in this tragedy. If we survive, of course, it's needed for that. But these are positive side effects of this.
Yeah. I mean, let me first of all agree with you entirely that I see this as a state-building moment for Ukraine. Right? This has been. I mean, in tragedy, there was also this great opportunity, essentially, for the Ukrainian nation to sort of present itself to the world, and has done an amazing job, of that. I can, and I think in a way that is the biggest thing that's happened in this crisis. Right? The biggest victory that's happened in this crisis is that Ukraine has become, on the world stage, a nation, right? A real nation. So if the debate was about Vladimir Putin says Ukraine's not a nation, I'm going to prove it. Ukraine says we are a nation, we're going to prove it. They've already proved this, right? And that's by far the most important thing that happened so far. I think that you can see this in a couple of different perspectives. So I was thinking about like Charles Tilley's view about the state, right? For instance, the states are often born in war, and it shows you why that is, right? That it's partly a matter of forging kind of sense of common interest versus an enemy, which is a lot easier. And it also gives a sort of foreign dimension to it. That what does a nation actually mean? In sociology, political science, the most common definition of a nation is it's an imagined community. I think you deployed that kind of thought a few hours ago, but it's an imagined community, and the real question of nationhood is: are you going to die for this imagined idea that you have in your head that you're somehow an X or a Y, right? Something. And for European nations and really the world, nobody really perceived Ukraine as a place that had a lot of people who were going to die for the Ukrainian idea. It was seen more as a kind of pretty corrupt state where people were more likely to emigrate than to stay.
That's true.
Yeah. Okay, there's a lot of truths that overlap. But I think that, a corrupt state where people emigrate, I don't know if there were some interviews in the press. I love Ukraine, but not that much. I'm going to go, but the reality is that Ukraine has proven that it has quite a lot, thousands, maybe tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people who are going to die for the Ukrainian idea, essentially, are willing to die. And that has elevated the status of Ukraine to what you might say a real nation or sort of strong European nation. I think that's why Ukraine has been embraced, that identity. Not only is it European people, but it is also a people as a nation that's willing to fight for it seriously for its objectives, that is elevated to consideration of being part of the European Union club, if you will. And so in that way, this conflict has been an opportunity for Ukraine. Of course, an opportunity they prefer not to have in the first place. Another anecdote, though, it made me think about just when you think about the foreign public relations aspect of whether you're a nation or not. So since 1991, I've taught Russian East European politics to students, various universities in the US. And I often make them take a map quiz. And when I first started doing up the map of the former Soviet republics, people would look at me like in shock, horror. Like, you can't possibly say that I need to remember the name of this country. I was like, Kyrgyzstan. That's not. I was like, well, it's a real country. And they're like, no, it isn't. It's like some. I mean, they didn't say this, but what they were thinking was it's some former Soviet republic that showed up on the map inconveniently around test exam time, and now my professor, who's insane, thinks that I need to know the name of this country. Right? That's really what we've been talking about in terms of the reception internationally of former Soviet republics. And Putin plays into that, saying, no, they're not real, And so this is, Ukraine's opportunity to prove definitively to people around the world that they actually exist. And that's a kind of aspect of the Westphalian nation-state system. If you think about it, the United Nations works pretty similarly. Everybody has to vote, should you get a seat? Are you seated? Are you recognized? And so, let's see. So I think that another part of your question was about the EU. So I think you were trying to juxtapose this sort of nation state building process to sort of like supranational building process, and this kind of, in a way, sort of sacrificial vision of sovereignty, where Ukraine is at the one hand demanding sovereignty, on the other hand offering up its sovereignty on the altar of European integration, right? Saying, I give you my sovereignty and I want to be part of the European project, right? One of my, concerns about the war, in a way, is that, right now tearful Ukrainians are demanding Western troops and intervention airplanes in their war. At the same time, that's sort of like a double-edged sword to my mind, right? Because if I'm right, this is how Ukraine's being welcomed into the world. To some extent, you don't really want to feed into this, again, Moscow-centered narrative that, it's just a Western figment, and it's a Western project to create an independent Ukraine. It doesn't really exist. The more Western troops are on the ground, the more that verifies that, if you know what I mean. So to some extent, this is, has to be, Ukraine's struggle, right? At the same time, the West wants help. It has a lot of different ways of helping. But I think there is that kind of, I guess it goes to this interplay of like, how much is this about Ukraine as a nation? How much is this about the European project, right? Of creating a community of various different nations that oppose autocracy, oppose, war like this. So, well done pointing that out. I think it is contradictory to some extent. It's a kind of, I guess that can be understood in this framework that what we're really talking about is broader. Like, there's some of the people I've been interviewing the last several weeks are priests. Okay, and priests, have this vision. This kind of European debate about Europe is about values, right? It's actually first and foremost about Christian values, humanism, Enlightenment, etc. And they look at the secular debate about European values and say, okay, that's interesting, acceptable. It's just they're parroting us without talking about God, but it's essentially the same thing. I think from a Catholic perspective, or some type of Catholic perspective. So I think it's also about the identity project is also about being part of Christian Europe. It's a part of being part of values Europe, and then you asked also the Russia question, right? So the Russian identity, I think the best answer to that is that Ukraine has been moving. Most Ukrainians have been moving in a pro-Western direction. I interviewed back in, I don't know when I was doing research for this book, a university administrator, somebody who was like almost like my counterpart, maybe a little more senior in one of the Odessa University, who was a Russian speaker, who was saying, I'm learning Ukrainian now, and I'm sympathetic. I want to be, basically want to be part of the state building project in Ukraine. That's one of the moments when I realized that, a lot of people, regardless of where they came from, they're in Ukraine. They want to be part of the Ukrainian story. And there's nobody who's been more symbolic of that, of course, is Zelensky himself, right? Who's a Russian speaker, right? And, was honestly, his reception's been interesting. I follow this all the time. And nationalist Ukrainians have been rather skeptical about Zelensky. And most nationalist Ukrainians that I follow really have not liked Zelensky at all. They distrusted him from the beginning because they thought he was a little bit too soft on Putin, that he was, more oriented towards Russian people, even potentially disloyal in certain circumstances. His popularity rating, by the way, in Ukraine was 22%.
Just to remark what you were saying about the European supranational identity, that we have an emotional historic memory and a rational historic memory.
Okay.
The emotional historic memory is tied to defeated revolutions, unsuccessful defeated revolutions, and the rational historic memory, what is the most popular in Hungary, in the last, concerning the last 400 or 500 years of Hungarian history. This is the time of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy after 1867 until the First World War, where we were not voluntarily, but we gave up our autonomy in three questions. That was a common defense, common foreign policy, and common monetary policy, or something like that. So this was and this was the most prosperous time of the Hungarian history in the last 400 years, and it's accepted. It's just another case that all the national holidays are tied to defeated revolutions, but people know rationally that it has sense at that time. Right. And something like can be in the case of EU, all nations will have their national holidays, while nationally they would understand that without this supranational identity, they cannot survive as single nations, especially under the threat, under the Russian threat now, which now became not a...
Absolutely, Other questions, or maybe, I don't know where we are in time. We have a time for another question or two, if you'd like.
I have a very short technical question. Why do you think President Biden is so much against this no-fly zone arrangement?
I think it's really simple. I mean, he just doesn't want U.S. planes to shoot down Russian planes.
Oh, that's
I mean, do you remember when Turkey shot down a Russian jet? So they don't want to be in that situation. Right.
No, there can be other planes.
What? Who else are you going to shoot down? Who else are you going to shoot down? In a no-fly zone, what you're basically doing is you're saying, this is this territory, and any plane who comes into it, I'm going to shoot it down. So who else is going to come? Except friendly planes, right? The Ukrainians, they would shoot down. But they would shoot down the Russian planes. So, that's the whole point of the no-fly zone is it's a sort of free, it's
So
basically.
I think he's saying it could be non-US planes shooting them down.
Oh, I
The
see.
problem would still be NATO.
Yeah, it would be NATO planes shooting them down. Yeah, so, I think basically every other nation in NATO would have the same concern.
That seems to be a kind of idea of swapping these MiG-29 and the American whatever.
Yeah, that's a different issue. So there's two distinct issues. No-fly zone is basically kind of like declaring open season on anybody flying in this. If you fly into this area, you're going to get shot down. That's a no-fly zone, and that means definitely that Russian planes will get shot down. And potentially add to this escalation scenario, which is not exactly the favorite scenario for military planners. Largely because they don't really want to get involved in that, probably. But then the question of giving aircraft to Ukraine, I think, is much more sensible, right? Move, although apparently our military has said that it's too high risk at the moment, but they also said that it's too high risk because Ukraine already has planes, which says to me that, well, maybe at some point if they didn't have planes, they could reassess, right? So I see those as two quite different issues, but they would both be sort of escalatory on a military track, right? And it's not clear, in the end of the day, it really comes down to, is somebody, Ukrainian army or the US army or the German army, right, going to march into Ukraine and push back the Russian army to the borders of where we think Russia is, right? And the answer is no, not really. Nobody's going to do it. So from that point of view, then why escalate? If you're not willing to do that, why are you going to escalate? It's not reasonable, right? It might be, if you think that Ukraine has the authority to do that and you could arm Ukraine, then by all means, let's send some weapons in there. But I just think that's the ultimate thing is, maybe that'll emerge in the future, but I'm not, those are all like, that was phrased as a sort of, I think, a temporary decision. And no country wants to really take on the risk of being the first to sort of send, certain types of highly visible, weapons, and obviously everybody's sending all sorts of weapons in, but mostly, Javelin missiles and things there are ways are defensive type weapons. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay, well, thank you so much for being here with me and and sharing your thoughts about the situation. It's something that is on everybody's minds, and we all need to talk through and think about in different ways. It's a great concern, great concern for everybody. And so, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with me today.